most of you are aware that the defense mechanism of our ego can show up with different intensity. For example, an 8 can be aggressively pursuing his or her needs, but may also just be assertive but without being disrespectful for others. And in very bad cases, the 8 may actually be destructive and even suffer from an antisocial personality disorder. But on the other extreme, in the very good cases, the 8 may show huge empathy and compassion for others and oneself. So these are all 8s, or during the course of lifetime, an 8 can go through these different states. Similarly, a 6 may be fearful of many things or have a certain alertness to whatever is around him or her. But in extreme cases, it may lead to a paranoidal personality disorder. Or in the very positive cases, the 6 may show up in a courageous way without being dominated by his or her fear. Now, there are different models that explain this spectrum of intensity of the defense mechanism of the ego. And the most famous model used in the Enneagram community is probably the Rizzo-Hudson levels of development, where we have 3 healthy levels where few people are, then 3 average levels where most people are, and again 3 unhealthy levels where unfortunately also some people are. But also Dr. Khaled El-Sherbini created a very beautiful model called Stages of the Heart, based on Sufi wisdom, and which does not only include the more earthly levels, but also some more higher spiritual ones. And also Beatrice Chestnut and Uranio Paz came up with a model of levels of awareness. And all these models talk about the same thing, but they just have their own merits and advantages. The model that I use is based on ancient Vedic wisdom. I will not go into too much detail about it in this course, but it's based on the natural order of the universe. So it actually has the most similarities with the model of the stages of the heart by Dr. El-Sherbini. It's a model that can bring the Enneagram and other tools like spiral dynamics together in a very coherent and complementary way. Now, in this video, I will very briefly explain this model because it's the basis for the rest of this lesson, which looks at how the intensity of the defense mechanism of our ego, or the level of development, has an impact on our sexuality and sex life. First of all, when we're looking at any spiritual tradition, we notice that there is always some kind of division between how we experience things normally on Earth, how things could be in some kind of ideal situation but we never seem to achieve this, and how things could be awfully wrong and we really try not to get there. So for example, in Christianity, we just live in this material world, but we know there's a heaven or a kingdom of God which is governed by perfect qualities. But there is also a hell, which implies permanent suffering without any hope for improvement. Many ancient civilizations similarly spoke about some kind of heaven and an underworld. And basically what we experience on Earth is what we call this material experience. And what is beyond, both below and above, is what we would call spiritual. But it's very important to realize that there's some kind of angelic spirituality, which is bright and characterized by a state of happiness and fulfillment and which pulls us up, so like heaven. But there is also a demonic spirituality which pushes us down, which we know as hell. Unfortunately, many spiritual experiences that people may go through may look angelic, but are actually very demonic. These demonic energies just happen to disguise themselves very well. It's not that these 3 are entirely different realms of being and completely separated from each other. No, we can actually get a glimpse of heaven and hell on Earth already. Some people are living a life of heaven on earth, but sometimes we can make someone's life into a hell. So instead of seeing it as three different categories, you should see it more as some kind of spectrum. So let's now move to the ego states. According to the systemic thinking of the Vedic wisdom, the physical reality or material world consists of four classical elements or Mahabhutas: earth, water, fire, and air. We should not think of them in the literal sense of the word, but more into some kind of abstract density of matter. Look at it more through the angle of solid, liquid, plasma, and gas. So it determines how heavy or light something is. We don't use these classical elements much in everyday life now, but it was very much used by the ancient Greeks in medieval times and so on. But beyond our planet, there are some other elements as well, but we hardly ever use them. For example, ether or the void is beyond these four elements and may be used by philosophers to talk about some metaphysical concept of nothingness. And some Vedic scriptures even talk about something that's even beyond the void, which they call consciousness. So it's even lighter than nothingness. On the other end of the spectrum, we can find some states or density of matter, which is even heavier than solid. These densities of the underworld are not named in Vedic scriptures, but just think of black holes that are so dense that they absorb everything, even light. So we can talk about the density of material objects, but we can also apply to this to non-material concepts, such as our mood and our ego. So it's about the heaviness or the lightness of our ego. So for example, you can feel very heavy or depressed. You can have a heavy heart as you carry a lot of sadness. Or on the other side, you can feel very light-hearted and free of worries. And again, this is very much a spectrum. It's not that it's either one or the other. So now let's go through this spectrum of ego densities, and let's start from the bottom and go to the top. In the lowest ranges, we are outside of the normal material realm. This is a realm where human beings in the physical world are not supposed to get. And these energetic qualities are invisibly around us, but as a human being, we shouldn't get there. Still, if a person is not able to cope with some trauma, or if a person is using too much alcohol or drugs, or if the addictive behaviors and bad habits get out of hand, a person may end up with such a heavy ego that he or she is no longer operating or functioning adequately in the world. It's as if these people are operating in some kind of different universe. So these people may be physically present in the world, but their ego and their mind is entirely disconnected from their environment and the people surrounding them. Some may have a lot of energy and want more and more, but the more they get, the worse they feel. So this is a state of hopelessness. It's a state where a person has zero awareness, zero consciousness, zero self-reflection. But it's an entirely reactive state. In this state, people are unable to establish true contact with others or have any sense of empathy. So it's a gradual disintegration of the psychological structures, which can at the end even lead to a collapse of the psychological structures. So in the worst case, such people are suffering from persistent depression, personality disorders, and other psychiatric conditions. And they can even become a threat to others and themselves. And in this state, we have no more hope to get out of this dead-end street. So people may not have energy at all, and others may use their energy in an entirely uncontrolled and dangerous, destructive manner. So with such an ego state, people are no longer living the human experience. And this is what some religions would call being possessed by demons or living in hell. This is when people are entirely driven by their instincts, and their heart and head intelligence are not able to gain any control over these primordial drives for survival. So, as it's outside of the human experience, it's hard to give it a name that would allow us to capture it, but let's call this ego state compulsion and destruction. So, in terms of density, this is a density of the ego that's even heavier than Earth. You could compare it to the attraction field of a black hole. It's a density that is so heavy that it has an incredibly strong attraction or gravity that attracts anything, which ends up leading to death and destruction. And without external support, you cannot get out of this incredibly strong gravity. For those of you who are a bit familiar with Vedic terminology, this refers to Rahu and Ketu, which is like a snake that eats its own tail. And this snake is also known in Greek mythology as Ouroboros. And indeed, when we are in such an ego state, we are, so to speak, eating ourselves like the snake is eating its own tail. Or in Freudian psychoanalysis, it's closely related to the interplay between Eros and Thanatos. So I will not go into much more detail because this state is outside of the normal human realm and really requires professional external support. Now let's get to the normal human experience. When we have an ego density of Earth, we'll call this ego state fear. It corresponds more or less to the Riso-Hudson levels 6 and to a large extent 7. So this is the stage all humans start with, and most people do not go beyond it by the time they die. At this level, we have a huge sense of inner deficit, and our ego is controlled by its own fear of death and fear of not being able to survive. And each of the 9 enneatypes come with a more specific basic fear. Remember, type 8 has a basic fear of being harmed or controlled by others. Type 9 has a basic fear of loss and separation, of annihilation. Type 1 has a basic fear of being bad, defective, evil, corrupt. Type 2 has a basic fear of being unloved and unwanted. Type 3 has a basic fear of being worthless, without value apart from their own achievements. Type 4 has a basic fear of having no identity, no personal significance. Type 5 has a basic fear of being helpless, useless and incapable. Type 6 has a basic fear of not having any support and guidance, of not being able to survive on their own. And finally, type 7 has a basic fear of being deprived and trapped in pain. So each time comes with their own blend of fear. But where does this fear come from? Well, when a child is born, it has no sense of I-ness. It still feels one with the mother. There is no feeling of separation as long as the mother is present. But when the child grows up and becomes conscious of the I, it feels as if it gets disconnected from something bigger that ensures its safety, stability, security, predictability. And this disconnection from the mother leads to a sense of aloneness or loneliness, and it leads to a fear of death. But don't forget, the fear of death is simultaneously the desire to live. And this is why the 9 types also have their own basic desire, but I won't repeat them here. You can easily find them in The Wisdom of the Enneagram or many other books. So, in this ego state of fear, our focus is on having our needs, our desires, and our emotions to be met. Basically, we want to be served by others and the universe because we do not believe we can take care of it ourselves. So the fear of death is basically a deficit of trust in the universe. And because of this inner deficit, we are in a permanent survival mode. We use the defense mechanism of our ego in an extreme way, so it actually doesn't work, or it may even work against us. Imagine you go to a country where you don't speak the language and you ask a question in your own language, but your interlocutor answers in a language you don't understand. So what does your interlocutor do? He's just repeating the answer you do not understand, but just louder and louder. And the same thing happens here in the ego state of fear. Your answer to the suffering doesn't work, and you don't understand why. So what do? You just try harder and overdo this unsuccessful strategy even more. In this ego state of fear, the patterns of our Enya type and dominant instinct are what I would call the most crystallized, the strongest. But we do not have the capacity to see or recognize how we are not solving our own problems. We blame the situation around us, we blame the people around us, but we do not blame the way we deal with our problems. Basically, in the state of fear, we hope we get out of our suffering, but we fear it won't happen because past experience has taught us a lot. But when fear dominates us, our fears tend to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what are some characteristics of people in this ego state? Well, happiness comes and goes, and we experience big ups and downs, and we may get a feeling of happiness, but we don't experience this deep felt state of happiness. In fear, we overdo, we exaggerate our typical patterns, and we imitate the image we want to be, but we're actually full of hypocrisy and we don't want to see it. In fear, we are also prone to radicalism, fundamentalism, fanaticism. And it's either I have to do this or I should not do this at all. So it's a very black and white way of thinking without seeing anything in between. So this is also where we experience judgmentalism, racism, Islamophobia. It's all a coping mechanism to the fear of the unknown. So in fear, we're also very self-centered. We lack empathy, and we are very judgmental of others. Another thing that is also, it's all about more and more of the same. Quantity is mistaken for quality, as we do not have the ability to grasp what quality actually is. So it's a bit like the phenomenon of a woman who has 20 dresses in her cupboard and says, I have nothing to wear, I need more. Another thing is that because of the lack of introspection, we're very reactive in the ego state of fear. We're also highly insecure. So we develop a sense of arrogance or superiority to compensate for this inner deficit or inferiority. And also here, the 9 types will have their own blend or their own version of this sense of superiority. In fear, we also have an inner urge to control, be it directly or indirectly. And in fear, there is also no acceptance of oneself, others, one's love. So basically, there is no love. Also in the state of fear, there is lots of narcissism. And narcissism serves as a compensation for a lack of self-love. So in fear, all types have their specific blend of narcissism, except for 6s and 9s who are prone to the equally unhealthy anti-narcissism. In fear, we also have a sense of aloneness or loneliness because we feel no connection with the divine, with oneness, with unity, with God. And in order to compensate for this sense of aloneness, we need to maintain a permanent illusion that we're not alone. So, for example, through Facebook, social media, reading the news, meeting up with friends. But finding a confirmation of your illusion requires a lot of energy, which we don't have. And finally, personality disorders start in the ego state of fear. They're not as dangerous as in the ego state of compulsion and destruction, but they still bring quite some more damage than good. When we have an ego density of water, we'll call this ego state enjoyment. And this corresponds more or less to levels 4 and 5 in the Riso-Hudson model. Here we start letting go of the fear of the unknown, the fear of survival, the fear of death. And we loosen up a bit and we see that life is actually not that bad, it's not that harsh. Getting to this ego state is most often the result of a first awakening or an aha moment, such as a spiritual experience, the birth of a child, the death of a dear person, or the COVID pandemic, as many people experienced. And almost everyone has times they experience this state, but only a relatively small group of people will have this as their default state. So it's not that we are permanently in the same ego state or the same level of development. We have an ego state or level of development where we are most of the time, or default state. But in good days we may go up a bit, in bad days we experience temporarily a lower state, but normally after some time we just go back to this default state. In enjoyment, we're no longer stuck or immobile like solid things, so earth, but we become a little bit more fluid like water. So we have acquired an ability to change. We can transform our actions and reactions instead of feeling stuck. So instead of rigidly following the defense mechanism of the ego, we can be a bit more flexible. We can move in different directions. We can get ourselves mentally and emotionally in places where we wouldn't go before in fear. So we are less stuck with ourselves. But we also take ourselves a little bit less serious, and we may be able to laugh a little bit at our own behavior. Instead of automatically being guided by our passion, we may consciously decide to go towards our virtue. However, this doesn't come easily, and we only go there when we feel motivated enough. So we finally start to feel that we can change something, that we can lead the life we want. However, it's still focused on how I want to live my life. So finally we start enjoying our life, and this enjoyment is not Epicureanism. It's not running away from fear by seeking endless pleasure. No, the fear is still there, but it's perceived as being less acute, less threatening to my survival. And sure, there are challenges, but we know we can somehow manage the challenges. So life is good. We enjoy the taste of living now without fear. So we start doing things in opposite way as what we were used to do in fear. So this is the ego state of most people who are serious about inner work. But it doesn't mean that all people in the ego state of enjoyment are active in the self-development community, or that all people in the self-development community are automatically in enjoyment. There's also many people outside this whole self-development community that are just normal people who without external support have been able to find enjoyment in the state they are. There is one big danger with the state of enjoyment, and that is that we may easily slip back from euphoria to disappointment and get back to fear. And even worse, we may just replace one illusion about ourselves into an even bigger lie because of spiritual bypassing or listening to would-be gurus and pseudo-spiritual leaders. And also some branches of psychology which focus on developing a sense of individualism and entitlement can be counterproductive. And this doesn't mean that spirituality or psychology is bad. No, we just need to be careful with how we approach it. So what are some characteristics of people in this ego state of enjoyment? Well, We no longer perceive the world as being harsh, tough, difficult. So we can loosen our ego fixation and passion. We start to let go, we relax, we can accept that we cannot control everything. We no longer seek more and more, but we also start to enjoy quality a bit. So we basically seek a combination of quantity and quality. And in enjoyment, also the inner subjective experience becomes more important. As a result, we're also less reactive, so we're able to sometimes pause and think before reacting. So it's often more responding based on a mental process instead of reacting instinctively. In enjoyment, we can also see cause and effect a little bit more objectively, but not fully objectively. And as a result of that, we start admitting our own flaws and mistakes. And in order to deal with that, we can go for quick fixes in our own behavior, but we still do not go for the real deep changes that require more discipline. Finally, enjoyment is also the state where we start feeling more empathy and acceptance and less judgment. When we have an ego density of fire, we'll call this ego state mastery or self-mastery. And this corresponds more or less to level 3 in the Riso-Hudson model. This is a very mature ego state, so few people actually achieve it. And psychology is able to bring one very close, but without a mature degree of spirituality, it's almost impossible to achieve this state. This state requires a high degree of maturity, so few people can get there before their 40s or 50s, if they get there at all. But of course, some people can temporarily get there, and this is how a really good day feels like. So it requires giving up the focus on oneself and to see that one is part of something bigger. It requires one to consider oneself like a cell in a body, where each cell is fulfilling a role so the larger organism or entity will thrive in a healthy way. So it requires one to commit to serving a higher good. And this higher good is always going to end up being God, unity, oneness, the source. So here we no longer identify with our fear and with our passion, but with our virtue. So we're no longer seeking money, fame, stability, intensity, spiritual experiences, enjoyment, but instead we focus on contributing and bringing value to society. But it doesn't come from a state of deficit. It comes from a state of abundance. It's about carrying out our mission that benefits the world. So in this state, everything we do is based on discipline, mastering ourselves, mature self-control, where we do not just follow our needs and desires and instincts. It's about consciously regulating our own lives in order to carry out our mission in this world without getting distracted too much. Basically, what we cannot control will control us. So in mastery, we gain control over ourselves. In mastery, we start seeing the order in everything. In fear, we see chaos in everything. But in reality, chaos is just structure from a higher order. So in mastery, we bring order to that chaos. Just look at chaos theory, the table of Mendeleev, music harmony. It looks random at first, but once you see the order into it, it becomes relatively easy and straightforward. So an important element of order and discipline is that one needs to understand why the rules are there and why they are important. For example, before driving a car, you may not know the rules, but when you do learn the rules, then you basically cannot go against them anymore. If not, you are reckless and you bring yourself and others into danger. So In mastery, we learn about the rules even if we don't like them. And once you know them, you can no longer say you didn't know them. But often it takes quite some life experience to understand the rules of life. So hence, mastery doesn't come very easily or early. If you want to bring structure in your life, the quality of your life will change very much. But it's important that you know why you do what you do. And let me give one example here. If you don't eat heavy things in the evening, your digestion will be very light at night, so you sleep well. If you pray or meditate in the morning or a few times during the day, you remind yourself to be present. If you don't eat sugar, you keep your energy level constant. If you are friendly and thankful to other people, you will feel better. If you wake up early in the morning, you get many things done before going to work and you will be more relaxed. If you don't drink any alcohol, your mind will be sharper. If you take a shower as soon as you wake up in the morning, instead of checking your mobile, you start the day in a clean way. You feel better. You don't start the day with a useless mess. When you know all these things and have experienced the differences, you are obliged as a human to keep these things. This is true self-mastery. Just try these things for 2 weeks and just feel the difference. Once you know how life can be different, you can no longer live without it. So there is a big difference between the conscious discipline in mastery and the neurotic form of self-control and asceticism of some types in fear. In our modern day society, many people look very negatively at the word discipline because we believe it means we follow the orders or the wishes of somebody or something external. But in reality, discipline is not based on a demand from outside, but on a voluntary inner wish. If someone forces you to do something, you will not like it. You will resent it. You will fight it. And often, it will become some kind of source of suffering. But of course, there is often a thin line between discipline and compulsiveness or routine. Now, if something is driven by something internally, it'll be very different. It needs to be something you consciously decide yourself to do. And sure, in the beginning it may be very difficult and you may need to overcome some resistance. But after some time you actually enjoy it and you get energized by it. And as a matter of fact, after some time, you would miss it if you don't do it. So people who start doing sports or eat healthy food on a regular basis, they suddenly can no longer live without that anymore. So discipline is the exact opposite of suffering because it's based on the knowledge that there will be a positive reward for our effort. So discipline is not routine. It's not a habit. Discipline is conscious and routine is not conscious. So what are some characteristics of people in this ego state of mastery or self-mastery? Well, following rules and laws comes quite easily. In terms of self-development, people are no longer going for quick fixes, but they also tackle the more fundamental issues that require more discipline. And people can set and defend their boundaries in an elegant and mature way. People in mastery also try not to judge, but of course it can still happen, they're still human. And their actions are based on virtues, but sometimes the passion can still slip in. Also in mastery, people are no longer reactive. They're able to reflect when they're triggered. So instead of reacting, they're more responding. Another thing is that people in mastery fully accept life as it is. They accept others for who they are. They accept the situations as they occur. People in mastery also have a high sense of duty. responsibility and respect. And they're also very sincere and dedicated. They're also able to fully admit their own weaknesses, but in a self-compassionate way. And they have a very strong sense of empathy. People in mastery are very present, and there's a sense of relaxed alertness. They notice physical and emotional changes, but they are not overly sensitive. And finally, there's some kind of inner strength, but no power, like in fear. When we have an ego density of air, we'll call this state interest. This is the most mature and lightest ego density of the human experience. It's living the best of human qualities. So very, very few people achieve it. Most often these are people who have fulfilled their mission to serve the higher good and are preparing themselves for their transition to the other world. This is when a human being has become a true spiritual being. It's very much a life of observing, witnessing, and a reflective mind. One is very objective and sees things the way they are without any cognitive distortion by the ego. It's living in a permanent state of meditation in whatever they do. It is being comfortable with the certainty of uncertainty. It's no longer fearing death. There is no inner deficit, but one is guided by abundance. And the only purpose of life at that stage is just living it, without any expectations on others or on oneself. There are no more psychological problems or issues. People no longer get triggered, but don't confuse it with indifference. In interest, people use minimal resources to carry out their mission. And most often, this implies a separation of all material possessions. Either they pass it on to the next generation or to charity. And in this ego state, people are really in a state of happiness, which is true happiness. So they feel a strong inner sense of satisfaction and fulfillment, and not just a happy feeling as the result of an external event. In the lower stages, people believe that you need to fill some deficit and that you should meet some need in order to be happy. So as a small child, you believe you will be happy if you are with your mom and your dad. And later you believe you will be happy when you find a girlfriend or when you finally get your university degree. And after that, you may believe you will be happy once you buy a house. However, whereas you think you will be happy when you fill the inner deficit, you quickly understand you didn't really fill it. So in interest, there is no more feeling of an inner deficit. So there is no more a temporary happy feeling from the illusion of filling it, as what I described in fear. There is no inner deficit anymore because there is a sense of harmony, unity, connection with the divine. So there is no sense of loneliness or aloneness. Yet in interest, people feel very comfortable retreating from society. And again, this is not neurotic solitude. So what are some characteristics of people again in this ego state? Well, they are fully accepting the world, themselves and others as they are. There is no judgment or illusions. They live in full harmony with themselves and with their surroundings. They live life based on the laws of the universe, so they see true cause and effect. And they don't think in terms of good versus bad. There are no distortions by the ego fixation or the passion. The three centers of intelligence are in balance. The three instincts are in balance. And as a result, they tend to act adequately in all situations. They're fully present, with full empathy, with full gratitude. They live life in a state of full respect and responsibility. They live in full harmony with nature. And very often, they just know things. Because their three centers are in balance. And they access the wisdom of their body and the universe. Finally, let's briefly look at an ego state which is so light or diffuse that is beyond the realm of the material world. And as a result, it's not a human experience, but rather that of being an enlightened spiritual being. It's about sainthood. Hardly anyone on planet Earth is living with such an ego state. But some people may temporarily get there and get revelations. It's a state of knowing without thinking. It's a state of eternal and unconditional love. There is no infatuation, no idealization. It's a state where one sees the divine in everything. There's full satisfaction. There's zero suffering, zero melancholy, zero negative emotions. It's a state that actually cannot be explained. It cannot be defined. It cannot be put to words. So the more I explain, the more I'm actually fooling you. And as a matter of fact, there are even higher ego states which reach further into the divine. But as they are unachievable on earth, I'm not going to go deeper into them. But if you're interested, you should definitely look at the stages of the heart of Dr. Khaled El-Sherbini. So let's just summarize what the spectrum of ego states is actually all about. Well, it shows our level of connection or disconnection from God, unity, oneness. It shows our level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with life. It shows our level of abundance or inner deficit. It shows the level of our ability to accept and love others as well as ourselves. It shows our capacity for being present and our ability to let go. It shows how we get triggered and how we react to things that happen around us. In the heaviest ego states, we don't get triggered because we permanently are triggered. In fear, we get triggered and react automatically on the basis of our passion, but we're not aware that we get triggered. In enjoyment, we are often aware we get triggered and we can reach into our virtue, but we're not yet able to fully manage it. But in mastery, we know we get triggered and we're no longer reactive, but we make use of our virtue. And in interest, we no longer get triggered. And above, in sainthood, there is nothing to get triggered about. Now, before ending this video, there's still one small remark that I would like to make. Some people like to talk about the unhealthy levels, the average levels, and the healthy levels. And I prefer not to use these words because what does average mean? And is there anything in between, like healthy and unhealthy? Well, the destructive and demonic ego states of compulsion and destruction are clearly very unhealthy, as they're not even meant to be for humans. And on the other side of the spectrum, the holy and angelic ego states of sainthood are beyond what is clearly healthy, but they're not really meant for humans. So I prefer to talk more in terms of mature and immature. The states of fear and enjoyment are very much focused on ourselves, so I would rather call them passionate and immature. And the states of mastery and interest are more focused on being part of something bigger. So I would call these virtuous or mature states.